Hey everybody, this is Russ from Retro Game Core. Today we're going to review the Asus Microsoft ROG Xbox Ally X. Now that's not the official name, it's really just the ROG Xbox Ally X, but man, it is a little bit confusing. The way that I've been thinking about it is that it's part of a partnership with Asus where they made the hardware and then Xbox made the software and they added their own button. And it really is just the next iteration of the Asus ROG Ally X, which is one of my favorite handheld PCs of all time. And they have made a couple improvements here and there, but really most of the focus is going to be on the software. At the end of the day, this is an excellent handheld PC, much like its previous model, with some keen improvements, including the ergonomics as well as performance power. But they're also marketing this thing as being an Xbox when it's really just a handheld PC, and my conclusion after testing this for about a week is that it's a pretty lousy Xbox. The software could get better, and I do appreciate that they're at least trying after all of these years, but we're not there just yet. And so in this video, we're going to kind of take a deep dive into all the things that make this device good and bad, and whether or not I recommend it in the end. Grab your favorite snack and drink, and let's go ahead and get started. Okay, let's start with specs and then move into price, and the CPU on this unit is the AMD Ryzen AI Z2 Extreme. And among the Z2 series, this is the top of the line from AMD right now. It is essentially the same as the Z2 Extreme found in the Lenovo Legion Go 2, as well as the AI HX370 chips that we've seen in other handhelds and laptops, but the difference here is that this one has additional AI features built in. Now the key AI feature they plan on using with this, which is called Auto SR, is not ready yet, and so it's not a part of this review, but it may be something that I will look at in the future. But as far as just overall performance power, it should be the same as what you would find with the Z2 Extreme and that HX370. The model we're looking at today, the Xbox Ally X, comes with 24 gigabytes of RAM LPDDR5X clocked at 8,000 megatransfers per second. It also comes with a 1 terabyte 2280 M.2 SSD drive, so you could swap this out for something larger, up to 4 terabytes if you would like. Now the display on this is the same as it's been on the other ROG Allies, 7 inches LCD, 1920 by 1080 resolution, and it runs at 120 Hz refresh rate, and it is FreeSync or VRR compatible. The battery is also the same size as it was on the Ally X last year, 80 watt hours, which I think is actually plenty for most handheld PC use. The big hardware change are these new ergonomic grips, which do add additional weight, about 30 grams altogether. It's now 715 grams, or about 1 pound and 9 ounces. Connectivity is the same here as well, Wi-Fi 6E, Bluetooth 5.4, and it has 2 USB-C ports, one of them is USB 4. Out of the box, it's going to come with Windows 11 Home, as well as the Xbox full screen experience, which we'll talk about later. And one other thing of note is they kept the Hall sensor triggers on this device, but they added impulse rumble to the triggers, much like you would find on an Xbox controller. In terms of price, it is retailing for $1,000. You can get it on Best Buy and a couple other retailers. And yeah, that's a pretty big price increase considering that the original ROG Ally X, when it came out last year, was $800. Now, since then, they've increased the price of the Ally X up to $900 based on world events. And so, depending on where you draw the line in the sand, this is a $100 or $200 price increase over its predecessor. So right off the bat, we are talking about an expensive piece of hardware, and I'm going to try to keep that in mind as we go throughout this review. Now, one thing to bear in mind that this price for this chipset is actually not half bad. The other handhelds that have like the HX370 in them, or the Lenovo Legion Go 2, which has that Z2 Extreme in it, those are all way upwards of $1,000, usually around $1,200 or $1,300 each. So this is one of the cheapest ways that you can get this particular chipset in a handheld right now. It's also worth noting there is a cheaper model available, and I have one for review, but it won't be part of this particular video. They're calling it the ROG Xbox Ally, and I think it's a missed opportunity to call it the Xbox Ally S to align with their home consoles. This one has the same chipset as the Steam Deck, and it comes out at $600. We will test this one thoroughly in a different video. Of note, this is one of the few handheld PCs from a major manufacturer that does not come with its own carrying case. They sell it separately for $70, and I think that's pretty crazy. As far as I can tell, it's just a standard hard shell case, and $70 for something like this seems kind of crazy, so I would recommend looking elsewhere. If you're looking for something at that premium price point, I would recommend something from Waterfield. These guys make excellent cases that are made out of leather or canvas, depending on what you get. And yeah, these are definitely worth it, but they're on pre-order, so I don't have one just yet. Also up for pre-order is the Project Kill Switch from dbrand, in case you want something with a bit of a grittier texture, and it also has a hard shell cover that you can get as well. This is also not very cheap. It's $60 for just the grip itself, and then if you want to add that hard shell case on top, that'll cost you $80. The only thing that I could find that's a reasonable price and also out right now is this Tomtoc Sling case. Now, this is not actually made for the Xbox Ally X, but they've changed their title to say that it is. This was originally made for the Steam Deck. I've had this one for years, and it also works with like the Switch too. Basically any handheld PC that's of a larger size. And this is what it looks like right here. I wouldn't really consider this to be a case, but more rather a bag that happens to fit your handheld inside. So if you're looking for a very slim case, I would not recommend this, but if you're looking to, throw in the power supply and maybe an extra controller, you've got all that space within this bag. Over the past couple years, I've used it from time to time, but I will say that it is kind of bulky. Like, I don't like using it in front of me. It just seems like I'm pregnant or something. Like, it's just way too big. So instead, I like to put it behind me, and that's usually pretty good. I could just kind of treat it like a smaller backpack at that point. Anyway, just a quick note about accessories. It's still kind of a work in progress because this device is so new. Okay, let's take a look at the hardware, and of note, this is a review unit sent over from Asus, but like with all my videos, all opinions are my own. They're not seeing this video ahead of time, and no money was exchanged in any way. Inside the box, we've got a little cardboard stand like we've seen with their other models, and then the handheld itself. Other than that, we've got their 65-watt charging adapter. Now, the way I'm going to organize this video is to break it up into different chunks, and the first chapter is going to be about the fact that this is not an Xbox if you're thinking of it like an Xbox console. And I've seen this as being a marketing and communications challenge ever since it was first announced earlier this year. When it comes down to it, I think a lot of people still think of Xbox as a console brand, that it's some sort of box that you would put in your living room. And I think that as a result, people just expect to be able to play their Xbox console games on an Xbox handheld, but this is a handheld PC. So even though there are 13,475 console games that you can play on an Xbox Series console, you're not going to be able to play those same games on the Xbox Ally X. Instead, it only plays PC games, and there are a ton of PC games out there. I mean, you could play everything on Steam and GOG and the Epic Game Store, and of course, Microsoft and Xbox have their own store as well, with nearly 4,000 games available right now. But still, that's a lot less than the 13,475 that we saw on the console side. Now, some console games can be played on the Ally X because they have a PC counterpart, and it's part of what they call the Xbox Play Anywhere program. So if you happen to own any of the Xbox console games that have Xbox Play Anywhere, there's about 1,500 of them altogether, then yes, you can also play those on the Ally X, but still, that is a lot less than the total number that you can play on either console or PC. So my big takeaway here is that if you are a console gamer and you're looking to just basically get a handheld version of the Xbox, this is not it. This is a handheld PC. If you don't own PC games, then chances are you're going to have to buy a bunch of games to be able to play on here, unless they are part of that Xbox Play Anywhere. I'll leave a link to that catalog down below so you can kind of search through and see if your games are compatible. Now, if you're already into PC gaming, you've got a Steam account or something like that, then this is going to be right at home because you'll be able to play those games on here. It's essentially just a small computer. Think of it like a laptop, but with handles. And in that sense, like with the previous Ally X, this is an excellent handheld PC. So let's talk about all the good stuff that comes from the hardware itself. And my main takeaway here is that this new one is a lot like last year's model, but with these additional grips, an extra Xbox button, and then of course that new chip. The controls are very similar. We've got that Xbox placement of the analog sticks, and these have been slightly upgraded. I've always found these sticks to be good, but the major difference here is that they feel to have more tension to them. I know that was a complaint with other users and that it felt a little bit too loose, but this actually feels tighter. In fact, it is tighter than a regular Xbox controller at this point. The D-pad is also very similar to the original ROG Ally X, where it's got that shield style to it, and it's got a sort of matte texture. And it does have a rubber membrane underneath. You can feel it's a little bit clacky inside, but overall it is relatively precise, but I do find it to be just a little bit too sensitive. When doing the contra test, which is when I press down on the D-pad and then rock it left and right, what I'm testing here is to see whether or not the character moves easily. And if they do, that usually means that you will have false diagonals or false inputs. And unfortunately, with this D-pad, it is pretty darn sensitive. I can make the character move very, very easily. Another example for that would be when playing a precision platformer like Celeste, where you have to hit, left, right, up, and down, and then a diagonal, and all of those are very important. And I am getting missed inputs here and there. Not often, but enough to the point where it feels like this D-pad is a little too sensitive. Now, when playing games where diagonals are a priority, for example, a Street Fighter game, this actually feels pretty good when trying to do a Hadouken or Shoryuken. It's very easy to pull off, especially because we have that shield-style D-pad. So it really is going to depend on the type of game that you're playing, especially if you're playing a modern PC game. It's probably not that big of a deal since the D-pad's not a priority, but for retro gaming, this is a little bit sensitive for me. I wouldn't go as far as calling it a bad D-pad, but I've definitely seen better in terms of overall accuracy. On the right side, we've got our face buttons, and I kind of see this as being a bit of a missed opportunity because I would have loved to have seen the Xbox colors on this particular model. Now, they did that on the white model. They put the Xbox colors there. I think it looks great, and I would have loved to have seen the same thing on this device as well. For better or for worse, these buttons do feel the same as on the Ally X. They have that same kind of clacky feel to them, but they are easy to press down on and they don't have a lot of wiggle to them like they did on the original Ally. However, it does seem like these buttons are just a little bit louder than the original Ally X, and I think it has to do with the fact that there's just more plastic for the sound to resonate within. Let's do a comparison between the two, as well as with an Xbox Series controller. So my big takeaway here is the buttons feel fine, but they are quite loud. Probably one of the loudest buttons I've ever seen on a handheld PC. And it also strikes me as a little bit weird that in partnering with Xbox, they didn't carry over some of their hardware elements. We'll talk about this more in a different section. Now, one thing they did carry over is some of the Xbox branding. For example, we have a dedicated Xbox button, which will bring up their game bar. And then also within here, embedded in the plastic, is like little Xbox and ROG logos. It's kind of hard to pick up with my camera, but hopefully you can see the ad. It says Xbox ROG all across the front. One other change they've done is they swapped out the menu buttons, and I don't really like how this is set up now. On the previous model, the start and select buttons were up here, and then the two ROG or Armory Crate buttons were down below. And I always felt like that was a good position because naturally my thumbs would just reach for the start and select up here, and then you would have to make a concerted effort to press these ones down below. However, now the start and select are down below, and the two menu buttons are up above. Now, I've got some muscle memory after using the Ally and Ally X for so long, but man, every time over the past week I've wanted to press the start button, I accidentally press this library button, which will either take you to the Xbox library down here, or you can have it set that it'll open up Armory Crate library. Either way, that's not what I want to actually do when pressing that button most of the time. Now, I could talk all day about how this has been hard for me, but I just think it is actually kind of a bad design. For example, pressing the start button means you have to reach around the right analog stick just to access it. So it just doesn't feel very natural compared to just going right across here and pressing the button up above. And so this has been one of my major complaints about this whole menu button position for a while now, and that I just don't think this is a good placement. On the Lenovo Legion Go 2, they did the exact same thing, but that is a much taller device. And so naturally your thumbs actually go to the bottom button, so that was a good move, but in this case, I actually think it is pretty bad. Now, who knows, it's only been a week, and so potentially I will burn in new muscle memory and be able to hit the start and select more naturally, but as it stands right now, I feel like this could have been designed a little bit better. Finally, on the front, we've got our two stereo front-firing speakers. These are awesome. We will do a test later. Let's talk about the I/O on the top. We've got a USB 4 port. This is going to be capable of 40 gigabit per second. The next one is USB 3.2 Gen 2, so 10 gigabit per second. So if you've got like an eGPU, for example, you will only be able to use it with this one, not the second one. After that, we've got our charging and power LEDs, a volume up and down. This is a little exhaust vent for the screen, which is kind of funny. Then we have a micro SD card slot, our 3.5 millimeter headphone jack, and then our power button. And of note, this is also a fingerprint sensor, so you can unlock windows by just using your finger. After that, we've got the shoulders and triggers, and these feel identical to how they were on the Ally X. So I think they got a good amount of travel here with the trigger, and the shoulder buttons are easy to press down on. They are micro switches, a little bit loud, but not too bad. The major change is that these triggers now have rumble on them. And honestly, in most games, I have not noticed it at all. But if you are playing a game that supports it, like it does on an Xbox controller, you might feel it. It doesn't feel quite the same as an Xbox controller, but it will give you just a little bit of rumble as you're using it. Of note, the cheaper Xbox Ally, the $600 model, does not have the rumble inside. On the back, we've got our fan intakes, which then go into the exhaust, and then two programmable back buttons like we've seen with the other models. The Ally X made these smaller than the original Ally, and these are small as well. I like the positioning of them and their size. I just never press them accidentally, but they are there if I need them as well. On the bottom, we don't have anything going on here, just a few screws, and that's about it. Now, in terms of ergonomics, I think this is the best feeling handheld that Asus has made. The extra grips do give it about 30 grams of additional weight, but I think that is easily offset by how comfortable they are. My main complaint about the Ally X was that the grips themselves were a little bit flat given the weight of the overall device, and so I found it to be relatively flat and uncomfortable. I've talked about it on previous videos, but I bought these 3D printed grips from a company called Comfort Grips, which just snap right on top, and these have been a lifesaver for me and made the device a lot more ergonomic and comfortable to use. On the new Xbox Ally X, I found that this does not need a 3D printed grip, at least for me. It feels really big and comfortable, despite the fact that it's not that much larger than the original Ally X. So yes, I like these ergonomics, and I think it's probably the most comfortable handheld from Asus by far. Now, the screen quality on this is still good, and it's the same as it was on the previous model. So it gets up to 500 nits of brightness, which I think is good enough to be able to play outdoors. Even in direct sunlight, it's pretty good. They also put a special coating on this glass to make it less reflective, and I really enjoy that. It's been the same way with the other models as well. So I'm not going to go into too many details about the overall screen quality other than to say that yes, it's good. It gets pretty darn bright. It's not as great as an OLED, but still, I think it's decent. I think one of the main benefits of this display is that it's 120 Hz variable refresh rate. That means that as you're playing a game, as long as it's getting somewhere like 40 frames or better, it's going to be a smooth experience even if it is going up and down. And so I like the luxury of not having to lock a frame rate to get smooth gameplay, and that's what this screen provides. The audio is also still very excellent, just like it was on the previous models. I think this is some of the best audio that you can find on a handheld PC, bar none. So hopefully you can hear how good this is. If you use bad speakers with the Hades 2 song, it sounds especially muffled, but everything here sounds very distinct and nice. And so yes, as before, I love these speakers as well. So putting this all together, yes, I think this is an excellent handheld PC, and it really rivals all of the other best options that you can find on the market right now. However, like we've talked about already, it kind of markets itself as an Xbox. And so even though I think it is a good handheld PC, it's kind of a lousy Xbox, so let's talk about that. Now, the way I'm approaching this section is as a long-term Xbox fan. I played the original Xbox. I had one. I didn't use it that much, but I remember playing through Knights of the Old Republic and Halo with my buddies and stuff. But it wasn't until around 2006 when I picked up the Xbox 360 that I really fell in love with the brand and the console itself. And the way I see it, if they're going to put the word Xbox on a handheld, that raises my expectations to a level that's going to be at the caliber of Microsoft and Xbox. And that's where I think it falls a little bit short. And there are three main points that I have here. Number one, this thing just does not feel like an Xbox. The triggers on the Ally X are great. I think that they are functional and they do a good job, but I think that they really could have wrapped together the whole ecosystem by using the Xbox Series triggers, which I really love. It's certainly not the end of the world because the Ally X triggers are definitely functional, but I think it's a lost opportunity to kind of bring this branding all together. Another way to make an Xbox handheld feel like an Xbox would be to use Xbox face buttons on it. These are something that we are all very used to as Xbox users. I personally like the rounded feel of the Xbox controller buttons, and I think that would have been a welcome change, and again, just something that would have brought it all together. At the very least, they could have used the coloring from the Xbox controllers over on the Xbox Ally, which unfortunately, again, they did not do. Now, these two don't really change anything in terms of functionality, and so it's really more of a cosmetic and feel thing, but I think that if they had used the Xbox Series D-pad, that would have been a big improvement. Like I already mentioned, there are some flaws with the Ally Xbox D-pad, and even though I think that the Xbox Series D-pad's a little bit too loud for me, overall I think it's much more precise, and I would have preferred to have that. It really is kind of strange to me that Microsoft allowed the Xbox name to be put on something that is so far and different from their other hardware. The only thing I would not want to have changed over from the Xbox controller over to the Ally X are these analog sticks, which I think are much better. They have better tension to them, they're about the same size and grippiness as well, so yeah, I think maybe keep the analog sticks, but change out all the other controls. I would have really appreciated that. Now, none of this is a deal breaker for me, but it just feels kind of like a bummer that they didn't go out of their way to make this feel like an Xbox as well. Now, the second reason why I think this is kind of a lousy Xbox has to do with that software experience, which has been updated, but right now it feels very clunky. This new setup is called the Xbox Full Screen Experience, and it's still running Windows, but it's kind of hidden and modified in certain ways. For example, it doesn't load all of the assets. There is no task manager or taskbar running, and instead it's just like this one single screen. It's kind of like Windows Big Picture mode. And it does cut down on some system resources. For example, it uses about 2 gigabytes less RAM altogether. And the overall UI is meant to be used with a controller, so you can navigate through like your home screen, or you can go down to like the library and see all of your installed games, or even go and do some cloud streaming. You've got all of these options here, much like it is on the regular Xbox app on a Windows desktop. So the big difference is that you can just navigate everything with your controller, and it also does not have some of those other Windows functions like your start menu. You cannot access that unless you go into the full Windows experience. Beyond just what you can find in their Xbox app, you can press the Xbox button to bring up the game bar, and this is going to be pretty familiar if you've used it in Windows before. It's essentially the same thing. So you can navigate through some recently played games or go into these settings to make some just real quick changes. For example, if you want to turn the device off or turn off Wi-Fi, you have access to those functions here. You can do other things like see your Xbox friends or do an audio mixer, screen captures, performance metrics. All these things are very typical of the Xbox game bar. The only other major difference here is that you can now go into what they call the Armory Crate Command Center. So this is again like the quick menu that we had on the Ally X, but now it is a function within the game bar. And this is where you can do all the stuff you could before, change out your performance profiles, your resolution, your screen refresh rate, all those functionalities that we've come to know and love. On the other side, we've got our library button, and you can set this to either open up the Xbox library, which literally is just this button right here, or you can change it to open up your Armory Crate library instead. And so this is the full-scale Armory Crate app that is also functioning at the same time with your Xbox software. And this kind of leads to the next point in that there's a lot of conflicting and redundant issues with this overall software experience. Let me walk you through a couple examples. You can go through the library in the Xbox app, and it'll just automatically detect what you have installed. Steam games, Game Pass games, all that stuff is going to show up in one main library. And that is definitely handy to use, but one of the unfortunate things is that you cannot modify this in any way. So for example, they pull some of the icons from the games, but you can't change that. You can't make your own artwork or anything. And so, you get to a game like, for example, Sulaco that does not have an icon, and unfortunately, it just doesn't have any artwork to it. It kind of looks ugly. Now, in addition to this library, we can also use our Armory Crate library. If we press and hold the Xbox button, it'll bring up like a task manager so you can jump through whatever's open. So let's go to the Armory Crate app, and you can see that in their library, they have the same thing set up, but it's a lot prettier. And so this does the same thing where it detects what you have installed, Xbox or Steam games or whatever, and it puts them all in one place, and I think it looks a lot better. In addition, this one's been around for longer, so you're able to go into game info, and you can change out the game art if you would like. So I really like that functionality. You've also got a lot more functionality within Armory Crate. For example, we can go in here into the game profile, and we can make changes like, individual game button mapping for each of these. And so I really enjoy that. And this is just kind of odd that we have two different ways of managing our library, and one is definitely more mature than the other, but it's kind of weird that there's a competition in the first place, considering the fact that this is supposed to be a partnership between Asus and Microsoft. Why do we have to choose which library to use? And so honestly, for me, I have not really been using the Xbox app that much at all, even though yes, I can navigate through everything. It's just as easy to have it open up to Armory Crate instead when I first start up the device. That's an option within the software. And when you put it together, it just kind of feels like everything is in competition. For example, you've got your game bar button, which also includes like the command center from Armory Crate, but you can also just press the command center button, which is right next to it. Why do we have two buttons that do almost the exact same thing? I also think this library button is mostly not necessary either. I feel like all of these things could be done with just one single Xbox button, like it is done on an Xbox controller. And so it just makes the overall experience a little bit confusing and very much so not an Xbox feeling. Here's one more example of how things can get kind of confusing. If you press the Armory Crate button, you can go in here and you can power off your device right down here. But if you want to do it the Xbox way, you could also press the Xbox button, then go over to the Settings tab, and then right here we have these same power options too. It's really strange that we have multiple ways that are so close to one another to do the exact same thing. And at this point, we're only talking about these stock apps, Armory Crate and Xbox, and they're already competing with one another. But once you start using things like Steam, to launch into a game that way, it is going to be another window that's going to battle for priority as well. And so it doesn't feel like a very fluid kind of experience right now. Now, there are some good and bad things with the overall Xbox app. I think just in general, it's a little bit kind of buggy and sluggish. It's not quite as snappy as it is on the console, but it is nice to be able to jump into my library. And it is pretty handy to be able to browse through like your Game Pass games or different deals if you want to buy a game. And they have been working on improving this experience as well. For example, they now have this compatibility rating. There are two options. There's one called mostly compatible. This essentially means that yes, you can play the game on your handheld, but maybe some assets are going to be really small on a smaller screen, or you'll have to use a keyboard input. But otherwise, yes, you can play the game on this device. Other games have handheld optimized, very similar to like Steam Deck Ready. So this basically means that the overall experience should be very good on this handheld. And then finally, you also do have games that are listed as being unsupported. That doesn't necessarily mean that it cannot play. It just may not actually have been reviewed just yet. So in the end, I think that this software has got a lot more improvement ahead of it. It's a little bit clunky to use. It's hard to even figure out where your cursor is most of the time. Like just overall UI elements probably need to be improved. But the best thing about it is that this is the worst that it's probably ever going to be because, as the engineers work on it more and more, this will probably be an improved experience. And I like the fact that they're even taking these initial first steps. But the simple truth is that it does feel like the Xbox app and overall full screen experience is well behind the other software options that we have right now. On my original ROG Ally, I just use Armory Crate as my main software, and I find that to be just a more beautiful and intuitive experience. Now, this used to be pretty darn clunky, but over the years, they've made it a lot better. And above on my Ally X, I actually run a Linux operating system on this called Bazite, which essentially works like SteamOS. So this also, I think, is miles ahead of the Xbox experience right now because it is a full screen experience that is controller focused and feels a lot smoother and more intuitive. And so again, this is another reason why the Xbox Ally X to me is kind of a lousy Xbox because in actually using the Xbox app, it is a worse experience than using the other options that we have. If you're coming from the console experience where everything feels nice and snappy, it definitely doesn't feel like that. I do hope the software improves over time, but as it stands right now, yes, I'm not really enjoying this overall experience. Okay, and the third reason why this kind of feels like a lousy Xbox has to really do with Xbox themselves, because they have really muddied the definition of what an Xbox is supposed to be. And if we take them at their word, this thing is an Xbox, but it's not really the Xbox that I think that most people want. A good example is the Xbox console prices. They have gone up twice in 2025 alone. The current price of an Xbox Series S model from launch is now $100 more than it was 5 years ago, and the Xbox Series X has increased in price $150 from its launch in November 2020. Now, as gamers, we're not used to prices going up on consoles. In fact, we're used to them going down, and that's what we've seen in all of the other previous Xbox generations. Now, hardware prices are going up. The Nintendo Switch 2 came out $150 more than the original, and then PlayStation has even increased their prices as well. So this is not a Microsoft thing altogether, but really just a sign that hardware is getting more expensive. And I do think that for the $1,000 and what we're getting here, this is a competitive price point compared to other options and the world market right now. So I'm not necessarily saying this device is too expensive, but rather just that everything is expensive right now. Now, the unfortunate thing is that even though hardware is getting more expensive, software is getting more expensive too, and we've just recently seen that with a change in the Microsoft Game Pass pricing structure. They've got 3 pricing tiers: Essential, Premium, and Ultimate, and the Ultimate one basically has everything, and that's going to cost you $30 a month as opposed to $20 a month previously. They've also locked away features and games in the other price tiers, so now if you want to play all the games available on Game Pass, you can only do that on Ultimate. Premium and Essential have a lot fewer games to choose from. Now, Game Pass as a service I still think is a pretty awesome idea. The ability to access 500 plus games on console and PC, and then also have day one access to many new games, and the ability to stream some of those games too, which allows you to test them out before making a big installation or to use them on Nvidia's GeForce Now. I think all that stuff is pretty neat. Now, Game Pass Premium is half the price at $15 a month, but it is quite a bit of a worse deal. It's only got 200 games to choose from, and it also allows you to stream, but you have to wait in line. And then finally, you do not have any day one releases either. Now, to make the waters even more mudded, they still kept their Xbox PC Game Pass, which has always been a pretty great deal, but they changed that up as well. This one's a little bit more expensive. It's $16.50 a month, but you do have more games to access. You've got 300 instead of 200. PC Game Pass also includes day one releases as long as they're part of that 300 game tier, but you do lose the ability to use cloud gaming, which is one of my favorite features, so that I can try out a game before I actually make that big installation. So now that I've walked you through all the challenges that Microsoft is facing in terms of hardware prices and software prices and how everything is just kind of confusing and muddy, let's now kind of do a bit of a role play. So close your eyes and imagine that you are an Xbox board member and you're trying to sell as many Xbox Ally X's as you can. And you've got all these levers that you can pull to try to get people excited about your brand, excited about your product. And let's talk about what you would do versus what they are doing and how I think there is a disconnect. So number one is the price. I think that at $1,000, they probably subsidize some of this cost from Asus, given the fact that we have this pretty expensive chip inside, but the price only increased by $100 or $200, depending on how you look at it. So I think they did a pretty good job here in making the hardware as affordable as possible under these current conditions. Now, from a software perspective, Microsoft owns Game Pass, so they should be able to do whatever they want with it. And the way that I would think about it as an Xbox board member is that I would personally recommend that they give a 1-year Game Pass with the device. It's just software, right? Like, they own all that stuff. They can give away those licenses. So what if they gave an Xbox Game Pass Ultimate subscription for 1 year with your Xbox Ally X? I think that would be an excellent gesture of goodwill to all those people who are buying into the Xbox ecosystem. Now, unfortunately, I am not an Xbox board member. I was kicked out of that interview process very early on, but let me tell you what they are doing about Game Pass. With every Xbox Ally X, they are giving you 3 months of Game Pass Premium. That's the one that gives you about 300 games, no day one releases, and you have cloud gaming, but you do have a queue. And to me, outside looking in, this just doesn't make a lot of sense. I feel like if they have the ability and they own the software, they should give the best experience possible for as long as possible to get people really integrated into your service. And then when it comes time to extend that service, then people are going to gladly do that. But if you're already shortchanging the customer by giving them just a middle tier with all these barriers and wickets in it already, then I don't think you're going to be winning over the hearts and minds of the Xbox fan base. So the reason why I'm going on this long rant about Xbox is because I'm a big Xbox fan and I want them to succeed, but to me, this does not feel like an Xbox handheld. It is a handheld PC that is Xbox in name only. And this is not necessarily a bad thing because, like I've said, it is an excellent handheld PC, but the fact that they're calling it an Xbox just kind of makes it weird from a branding perspective, and the software still has a ways to go. Okay, now that we've gone through all the doom and gloom of why I think this is not a very good Xbox, but still a great handheld, let's talk about one of the other great things about it, and that's the performance of the Z2 Extreme. And I think among the ROG Ally devices I've tested before, this one feels the most natural to me, and a lot of it has to do with its performance profiles, especially its 17-watt profile. Let's start with some benchmarks, both in Windows and Linux. We'll start with Windows using 3D Mark in the TimeSpy benchmark. And here's the results between the original Z1 Extreme Ally as well as the Z2 Extreme Xbox Ally X. And when I have it plugged in the max turbo mode, which will give you a 30-watt performance profile on this device, I got a score of 3191, which is about par of what I would expect with a Z1 Extreme. Now down below, I've got the Xbox Ally X, but I ran this one at the 17-watt profile, and I still got a better score, 3621. That means that by using a TDP that is about only 56% of the one up top, I'm getting 13.5% better performance. In other words, you can save battery life and still get better performance on the Xbox Ally X, which also has that massive 80 watt-hour battery. Now, of course, if you want to push performance, you can do that as well. When plugged in, you can use the turbo mode up to 35 watts on the Xbox Ally X, which will give you about 24.2% better performance than the original Xbox Ally and Ally X when pushing it to the max as well. And so already you can see that there is a performance uplift when going from the Z1 Extreme to the Z2 Extreme today. Now, in addition to doing benchmarks on Windows, I also did a few benchmarks using Bazzite, which I mentioned earlier is a Linux-based distribution that is very similar to SteamOS. So this is the main operating system I use on my regular Ally X, but then I also installed it on the Xbox Ally X to see how it performed against Windows. I made a couple videos talking about Bazzite, including a setup guide, but essentially it just treats it like a Steam Deck at this point. You can even bring up like the Steam menu, and you can also bring up the handheld menu, which will allow you to do things like adjust the power profiles. You're supposed to be able to change out your RGB lights too. That's not quite working on this version of Bazzite just yet, but it is brand new. The only major downside of using Bazzite is that it is not going to allow you to access Game Pass. So if you are looking to play Game Pass games specifically, this is not the way to go. You're going to want to stick to Windows. For our first test, we're going to do Shadow of the Tomb Raider, 1080p low settings, and I did it 4 different times. The first one was with the original ROG Ally running Windows, then the Ally X running Bazzite, and then finally the Xbox Ally X twice, both in Windows and then running Bazzite. And I tested it with multiple different power profiles. So the performance profile is the main one. So this is going to be 17 watts on the Xbox Ally X, but the original Ally will only go up to 15 watts. And then for turbo, everything will go up to 25, but when you plug it in, it'll also boost it even more. So on the original Ally, it'll go up to 30, but on the Xbox Ally X, it'll go up to 35. And so here's a look at the results with the 4 different tests, but then also the 3 different profiles. And the number one takeaway here with Shadow of the Tomb Raider is that using Bazzite will give you much better performance than Windows, to the point where the Z1 Extreme version of Bazzite runs just as good as the Z2 Extreme version of Windows. When running it at the 15/17 watt performance profile, you can see that there's about a 30% increase in performance from the Z1 Extreme running Windows versus the Z1 Extreme running Bazzite or the Z2 Extreme running Windows. And so across the board, you can see that this game will run pretty well, but it will run even better with the Z2 Extreme and even better than that running Bazzite. And so that's my big takeaway here, is that Linux does run this game a lot better. Now the next game is Returnal, again 1080p low settings in all 4 of those different console settings options, as well as the 3 different performance profiles. This one's a little bit different because Bazzite doesn't really run this game as well as Windows, and that's really apparent when it comes to the Z2 Extreme. There's definitely a clear benefit of using the Z2 Extreme over the Z1 Extreme, and again, Windows is a little bit better. That's the gray bar that's going to the right. The best example would be at the 15/17 watt profile. That's going to give you about 31% better performance just going from the Z2 Extreme from the Z1 Extreme. This is a game that's not all that fun to play on the Z1 Extreme. It's kind of stuttery and slow, but on the Z2 Extreme, I found it to be perfectly playable. It is worth noting that once you get to the higher wattages, it doesn't necessarily mean that you're going to get better performance, and we'll talk about that more later, but there are going to be some times when pushing more power into the device isn't necessarily going to be worth it. And then finally, the last benchmark game that I tested is Cyberpunk 2077 at 1080p with the Steam Deck preset. That means that it's going to have all the same settings as it runs on the Steam Deck, but at a 1080p resolution. This does include FSR at the balanced profile, in case you are wondering. And for this one, Linux just runs the game a lot better, and probably a lot of this is thanks to the optimizations that were made for the Steam Deck with this particular game. I think it carries over to these other chips as well when they are running a Linux distribution. The worst case scenario would be playing this game on the Z1 Extreme, that's the blue bar, at the very top at 15 watts compared to 17 watts with Bazzite and the Z2 Extreme. That's an 83% difference. Even looking at the 17 watt profile on Windows of the Z2 Extreme compared to Bazzite, that's a 51% difference there as well. So yes, if you are going to be playing Cyberpunk, it is in your best interest to try it on Linux first. So my main takeaways when it comes to benchmarks specifically with this device is that it really depends on the game as well as the operating system. There's no clear-cut winner here, but many times Bazzite does seem to be running the device a little bit better. You are going to lose out on Game Pass, so I would really only recommend this if you have a large Steam library, but if you do, it can be a pretty great time. So now let's talk about performance testing. We're going to stick to Windows just because that's what comes with this device, but let me know in the comments if you're interested in seeing performance on Bazzite versus Windows when actually playing games as well. What I'm going to do here is I'm going to play the most lightweight games that I can and then show you down below how much battery drain you're going to see at a wattage level and how much battery life you can expect if you went from 100% down to 0. And for some games, it's going to be pretty crazy, like over 10 hours with some of these lightweight games. This chipset in particular seems to do really well at lower wattages. And I didn't do anything special to get any of these numbers. All I did is went into the Asus Armoury Crate settings and then set it to the silent profile, which is going to cap out at around 13 watts, and then played my games from there. And I think what you can expect on average for a lot of these lightweight games is going to be somewhere between 8 and 10 hours of battery life. And that's mostly thanks to that larger battery of 80 watt hours, and then also the fact that this chip seems to run lightweight stuff really well. Now bear in mind, I'm playing most of these games at a 60 frames per second cap in order to get me the best battery life, but you can always unlock that too if you don't mind losing a little battery in the process. So with Horizon Chase Turbo, I can play it with a 60 frames per second cap, and it's going to give me about 9 hours of gameplay, a little bit less than that. If I want to run it at 120 frames per second, that's going to be quite a bit more demanding, and so that brings up the overall drain quite a bit, and so you're going to lose about 3 hours of battery life, but you will have 120 frames per second while you're playing. So it really comes down to how much time you have to play these games and then also what you prefer in terms of frame rate. Another example here would be Hollow Knight Silksong. You can play this one with a 60 frames per second cap and get a little bit over 8 hours of battery. When pushing it to 120 frames per second, surprisingly, it does not require that much more additional juice. You only lose about an hour of gameplay altogether, so instead of 8 hours, you can now play for 7 hours. Now beyond the very lightweight games, once you start getting into stuff that's a bit more demanding, even in the silent profile, you'll get a little bit less battery life, but still pretty decent. For Hades 2, I got a little bit over 7 hours of battery at 1080p medium settings and 60 frames per second. For Sulaco, I couldn't get a stable 60 frames per second, but it would hover around that range that worked well with the variable refresh rate, so it was still a pretty smooth experience, and I got 5.5 hours of battery life. For a slightly heavyweight RPG like Octopath Traveler 2, this one took a little bit more battery, but still pretty decent, about 4 hours and 18 minutes altogether. And then finally, at the higher end of the silent profile, I could play Ninja Turtles Splinter's Fate, 1080p medium settings, and I got about 4 hours of battery life here. Now, many games are not going to run great in the silent profile. You'll have to move it into the performance profile, which will be a 17 watt TDP. And I would say that the majority of PC games available on the Steam catalog are going to run great here. Maybe some AAA titles will require you to play in turbo, but you can still get some decent performance if you're willing to make a couple compromises here and there. Some lighter weight games like Hi-Fi Rush will play absolutely fine, stable 60 frames per second at 1080p medium settings, and still give you about 3.5 hours of battery life. I was surprised to find that Resident Evil 4 is perfectly playable at 1080p low settings at the 17 watt power profile. Now, it's not going to give you a stable 60 frames per second. It is going to rely on that variable refresh rate, but I would still say this is playable, and I get about 3 hours of battery life, which is pretty good. And so if you are jumping into a newly released game, something that has a 3D engine to it that might be a bit more demanding, this is about where I would start. At the 17 watt power profile, maybe kick it into 1080p low settings and see how it performs. You may be able to get some pretty stable frame rates here and still get about 3 hours of battery life. Even if it dips below 60 frames per second because of that variable refresh rate screen, it's still likely to feel pretty smooth. Now let's talk about changing up the power profile depending on what your goals are when playing a game. We'll start with Gears of War Reloaded. This game at 1080p low settings will give me an average frame rate about 55 frames per second, so mid-50s here, but I still think it feels pretty smooth thanks to that screen. This will give me a little bit less than 3 hours of gameplay time, but let's say that you have less time to play than that and you want to get the best performance possible. If you kick it up to the turbo mode, which will be 25 watts when not plugged in, this will give you a pretty stable 60 frames per second, and it is going to cost a little bit more battery life, about 2 hours and 10 minutes. And this is about the worst that you can expect when it comes to battery life with this machine, a little bit over 2 hours of battery when you have it in the 25 watt mode. And if you've only got 2 hours to play and you want to have the best experience possible, then you might as well just try this out, because even though it only gives you a slight uplift in overall frames, it's definitely going to play better than it did at the 17 watt power profile. Here's another example with Returnal. This one gets pretty good performance at the 17 watt power profile, about maybe 40, 42 frames per second on average, and this will give you about 3 hours of battery life. Of note, I did turn on FSR during this gameplay because I think it looks just fine and it does improve the performance quite a bit. Now, if you push it to 25 watts, you'll get a pretty good jump in performance, about 10 frames, so an average about 50, 52 frames per second. But again, it is going to require more battery life, a little bit over 2 hours. It's also worth noting that in all of my testing, I found that the device stays very cool, about 62 to 65 degrees Celsius at max, and it also stays relatively quiet too, to the point where I didn't actually do any testing because it's almost silent most of the time. I don't even realize that the fan is running. And so I think it's a really nice sweet spot between all the performance options and the cooling and the fan noise too. It's a really excellent experience. Let's do another example with Hogwarts Legacy. This one gives me about 38 frames per second on average at 1080p low settings, and that again will give me about 3 hours of battery life. And same story here, if we jump it up to 25 watts, we will get an average of about 45 frames per second, and then also it's going to take about, an hour less of battery life, so 2 hours altogether or a little bit more. Now, beyond just toggling between 17 and 25 watts, you've got one other ace up your sleeve, and that is that you can plug this in and get a turbo max of 30 watts instead. Let's use Doom the Dark Ages as our example here. They just recently updated this game to have a handheld preset, and it runs really well, and I think a lot of this has to coincide with the Xbox launch. So here, running at 17 watts with a 1080p handheld preset, I got an average about like 52 frames per second, which is pretty crazy with this game, which is very demanding. Now, jumping up to the 25 watt power profile is going to take, an additional hour of battery life, so you're only going to have 2 hours altogether, but you are going to get only minimal improvements in performance, about 55 frames per second in general. So you're losing about an hour of battery life, but only gaining about 3 frames per second. For me personally, I don't think the juice is worth the squeeze in this regard. However, if you jump it all the way up to 35 watts, you do see some returns there. So for example, in this particular scenario, I'm getting very close to like 58, 59, even 60 frames per second. So this is a more significant jump from the 52 that we saw at the 17 watt profile. So my take in this regard would be that I would use the 17 watt profile when playing this game just because 25 watts doesn't give you that much better performance. But if I can play it plugged in, I'm going to go all the way up to 35 watts because I can feel the difference there. So long story short, basically any game you can think of will probably play on this device as long as you're willing to make a couple compromises. Maybe use 1080p low settings or 720p high settings, and then also expect, worst case scenario, about 2 hours and 10 minutes altogether. And that, of course, is when playing it at a 25 watt TDP. If you drop it down to 17 watts, you'll have to make additional compromises, but you will be able to get about 3 hours of battery life, which I think is a really nice sweet spot altogether. Okay, we've done a lot of testing and a lot of ranting, so let's wrap this all together and talk about what I like and what I don't like about the new Xbox Ally X. Number one, this is a very comfortable device. I like the additional grips on it, even though it does add additional bulk. For me, it's comfortable enough that I don't need to search on Etsy for additional 3D printed accessories, so that's a win in my book. The screen is also still good. It's 1080p, 120 frames per second, and with that variable refresh rate. It's a little bit small by today's standards of being only 7 inches. I would love to have something that's 8 inches just because I think that would look a little bit better, but in general, I still think it's good enough. As before, the audio on this is amazing. It's one of my favorite devices to use with just the speakers that are built into it. Battery life is also great. You can expect 2 hours or so at a worst case scenario, but about 3 hours on average when playing at the 17 watt profile, which is what I personally use. Speaking of which, I think that these performance profiles are really well tuned between lightweight games and middleweight games and everything in between. I feel like the profiles that Asus has created here just works perfectly in sync with the Z2 Extreme, so I'm really happy with this entire setup. I also love that we already have some operating system options. There's a test build of Bazzite already out and it works great, and performance on this is a lot better than Windows in many games. So there are a lot of things to like about the ROG Xbox Ally X, but a few things I don't like as well. Let's talk about those. It's kind of crazy, but there's only really one hardware thing that bothers me, and that's the loud face buttons. They are pretty loud. There are other things I don't like about it, like the placement of the menu buttons, but it's the clackiness of the face buttons themselves that I wish were just a little bit quieter. Like I mentioned throughout this video, I kind of wish that they had borrowed some Xbox hardware things as well to really make this feel more like an Xbox device. That would have improved the D-pad, for example, and I think the triggers would have felt a lot better too. But unfortunately, this device is an Xbox in name only. It really is just an Ally X with additional grips and a new chipset, and then also that new software. And unfortunately, at least as of making this video, I find the whole Xbox full screen experience to be very clunky, to the point where I would rather use the Armory Crate software or even install a new Linux operating system. It's definitely a step in the right direction when it comes to using Windows on a handheld, but I don't personally think it's at an acceptable level just yet, so hopefully they will improve this over time. And then finally, we've got that $1,000 sticker price, and that is just a tough pill to swallow. I mean, $800 last year for the Ally X was really expensive, and now we're adding an additional $200 over the same time last year. Now, everything is getting more expensive, even my favorite cheeseburgers, but it's getting harder and harder to justify these really high prices just to be able to play these PC games on a handheld. So in the end, you're probably wondering what my final conclusion about this device is. Who is it for, and what do I think about it? And number one, I think that it's a good handheld PC, like I've been saying throughout this video. I also think that if, ROG or Asus had just called this thing the Ally X 2025, it would have been a nice little upgrade, a better chipset, nice grips to it. That would have been just fine, but the fact that they put the Xbox name on it really kind of muddies the waters. It's something that's kind of easy to overlook, but the fact that they're really pushing it as being an Xbox handheld just doesn't sit right to me because it doesn't feel like an Xbox in many ways. So putting it all together, who do I think the ROG Xbox Ally X really is for? I think number one, if you're looking for a handheld Xbox console, do not buy this device because, like I've mentioned, it does not play Xbox console games. So that's an easy one to check off right there. I also think that if you own a Z1 Extreme handheld like the Ally X or Legion Go, then it's probably not worth upgrading for this, especially at that $1,000 sticker price. Now, if you have a handheld PC and it's kind of showing its age, for example, the original Xbox Ally, maybe you don't like the controls on it or the small battery, then yes, I can see this being a pretty good upgrade. If you're looking to buy your very first handheld PC and this is within your budget and you think that the overall form factor and size is going to be a good fit, then yes, this is an easy recommendation just because it is an excellent handheld with a couple nitpicks here and there. But if you are a bit more cost conscious, then I think that you've got plenty of options. You could buy a used Ally or Ally X either on eBay or maybe find an open box one. And then of course the Steam Deck is still a great deal. It starts at $400 for the LCD model and it still runs most games just fine, just not like the most AAA of the AAA titles. And so that's my recommendation too. If you are on a budget, then this one is going to be way outside of that. Look for something that's used between the Ally and the Ally X, maybe a Legion Go 1, and then also of course the Steam Deck. Anyway, that's all I got for this video. Thank you for watching. This is a super long one, and so I appreciate you taking the time to go through everything. Now, one of the things I always get questions about is like, which one is my favorite? Now that the dust is settled and all the players of the handheld wars of 2025 are on the battlefield, like, which one is my favorite pick? And I'm not really sure just yet. I'm still kind of leaning towards the Legion Go S Z1 Extreme model. I think that chipset in particular still does just fine for the most of the games that I personally play, and I really love that screen. So I don't know, let me know if you want me to make a dedicated video about my favorite handheld PC of the year this year, and I'll think about it. But anyway, thank you for watching. Be sure to like and subscribe if you found this helpful, and we will see you next time. Happy gaming.